February 1943, somewhere over Guadalcanal, a 21-year-old Marine gunner named Tommy Chen stands behind a .50 caliber Browning mounted in the dorsal position of an SBD Dauntless, hands white-knuckled around grips that won't stop shaking. A Japanese Zero materializes at his 9 o'clock, maybe 400 yards out, banking hard left across his field of vision like a predator testing for weakness. Tommy does exactly what 6 weeks of training at Jacksonville told him to do. He centers the crosshairs directly on that distinctive rounded cowling, leads it forward by what looks like maybe half a plane length, just like the manual said, and squeezes the trigger. 70 rounds scream into the Pacific sky. Every single bullet passes harmlessly through empty air behind the Zero's tail. The Japanese pilot doesn't flinch, don't dive, doesn't even seem to notice that someone just tried to kill him. He just keeps flying his perfect arc, completely untouched, while Tommy's ammunition counter spins down and his hands start shaking worse. This wasn't Tommy's failure. This exact scene was playing out across the Pacific theater every single day during those early years. Marine gunners, well-trained, motivated, equipped with weapons that could tear through engine blocks, were missing, not occasionally, constantly. The Marine Corps conducted an internal study in March 1943, analyzing gun camera footage and debriefing reports from bomber missions over Guadalcanal and the Russell Islands. The results weren't just disappointing, they were catastrophic. Trained Marine aerial gunners were achieving hit rates below 5% against crossing targets. 5%. That meant for every 100 rounds fired at an enemy aircraft moving perpendicular to the gunner's position, 95 bullets were hitting nothing but tropical air. The mathematics were murderous. A typical engagement over the Solomons might last 6 to 10 seconds before the enemy fighter broke off or moved beyond effective range. The Browning M2 fired roughly 800 rounds per minute, about 13 rounds per second. In an 8-second engagement, a gunner could theoretically put 104 rounds into the air. With a 5% hit rate, that meant 5 bullets might actually strike the target. 5 hits weren't enough, not against a Zero. The Mitsubishi A6M, despite its legendary lack of armor, could absorb multiple .50 caliber rounds to the wings and fuselage and keep flying. Japanese pilots had learned to absorb hits to non-critical areas and press attacks anyway. To down a Zero reliably required concentrated fire into the engine, the cockpit, or the fuel tanks. 5 scattered hits across 8 seconds of combat rarely accomplished that. The human cost mounted quickly. During the first 6 months of the Guadalcanal campaign, from August 1942 through January 1943, Marine aviation units lost 132 aircraft in combat. Each bomber carried a crew of 2 or 3. That's somewhere around 200 Marine aviators killed, wounded, or captured every 6 months. And a significant percentage of those losses came from aircraft that couldn't effectively defend themselves against fighter attacks while their gunners burned through ammunition without connecting. The gunners were doing everything their training had taught them, tracking the target, maintaining sight picture, controlling their bursts. The problem wasn't their courage. It wasn't their commitment. It wasn't even their shooting skills. Not really. The problem was physics. And physics doesn't care how brave you are. Every gunner instinctively aimed directly at what they could see. It made perfect sense. You point at the threat. You pull the trigger. The threat goes away. That logic works fine when you're shooting at targets on a rifle range. It works when you're hunting game that moves at 20 or 30 miles per hour. But enemy fighters weren't white-tailed deer. They were crossing the gunner's field of view at speeds exceeding 300 miles per hour. Some of the newer models could hit 350. At those velocities, the time it took for a bullet to travel from the gun muzzle to where the target appeared to be meant, the target wasn't there anymore by the time the bullet arrived. The bullet itself moved fast, roughly 2,900 feet per second, leaving the barrel of a Browning M2. That sounds instantaneous. At short ranges against slow targets, it effectively was. But in aerial combat over the Pacific, short range meant 200 to 400 yards, and the targets were screaming through the sky at speeds that would have seemed impossible just 20 years earlier. A Zero flying at 300 miles per hour covered 440 feet every single second. Do the math on a 300-yard shot. That's 900 feet. At 2,900 feet per second, the bullet needed roughly 3.1 seconds to cover that distance. Doesn't sound like much, does it? But in those 3.1 seconds, Zero moved another 136 feet forward. 11 car lengths. The gunner aimed at where the aircraft was. The bullet arrived at where the aircraft had been a third of a second ago, passing through empty air while the enemy fighter continued untouched, probably lining up its own attack run. This phenomenon had a name: deflection error. Military scientists understood it in theory long before World War II started. The United States Navy had published papers on the subject as early as 1924, but understanding something in a classroom and solving it in combat were entirely different problems. The deflection required wasn't some minor adjustment, it was massive and completely counterintuitive. Against a target crossing at 90 degrees at 300 yards distance, a Marine gunner needed to aim approximately 15 to 20 feet ahead of the aircraft's nose. That meant putting your crosshairs on what looked like a completely empty sky, trusting that the target would fly into your stream of bullets. Every human instinct screamed against it. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Gunnery instructors tried teaching deflection shooting during training. The Marine Corps had established dedicated aerial gunnery schools at Naval Air Station Jacksonville in Florida and at Marine Corps Air Station El Centro in California, starting in 1942. Trainees spent hours in turret simulators. They shot at towed targets from moving trucks. They studied diagrams showing proper lead angles. They memorized tables of deflection distances. None of it translated effectively to real combat. The problem was complexity. Deflection wasn't a single calculation. It changed constantly depending on target speed, target angle, range, altitude, whether the target was climbing or diving, whether your own aircraft was turning. A Marine gunner in an SBD, Dauntless engaging a Zero, making a beam attack from the side, needed different deflection than the same gunner, engaging the same aircraft during a high-side attack from above. And he had maybe 4 seconds to process all those variables while being shot at, while his pilot maneuvered, while his oxygen supply at 15,000 feet made his brain work slower than normal. The psychological barrier was just as deadly as the technical one. Gunners who survived their first few missions and tried implementing deflection shooting often abandoned it after apparent failures. They'd aim ahead of a target, fire a burst, see their tracers arc through empty sky in front of the enemy plane, and conclude they'd led too much. Next engagement, they'd reduce their lead, move their aim point closer to the visible target. They were self-correcting in exactly the wrong direction, trusting their eyes over physics they couldn't see or feel. Gun camera footage from early 1943 Marine missions over the Solomons shows this pattern repeatedly. Initial bursts with some forward lead, followed by subsequent bursts walking backward until the gunner was shooting directly at, or even slightly behind, the target's current position. Their instincts were killing them, their training was insufficient, and men were dying because of it. The casualties mounted with brutal efficiency. Marine Corps records from February 1943 show mission loss rates of 8% per sortie during bomber operations over Rabaul. 8 out of every 100 aircraft didn't come back. The survivors landed with dead and wounded crew members, shredded control surfaces, engines trailing smoke. In the debriefings, gunners reported the same frustration over and over. They'd been shooting, their guns had been working, but their bullets hadn't been connecting. Something fundamental had to change, and it had to change immediately, because at the current loss rates, the Marine air offensive in the Pacific would stall before it ever reached the Philippines, let alone the Japanese home islands. The theoretical solution had been sitting in Navy archives since 1924. Written by an artillery officer named Lieutenant Colonel James Puckle, the paper was titled The Problem of Lead in Aerial Gunnery. Puckle wasn't some academic theorist disconnected from reality. He'd served in France during World War I. He'd witnessed the first clumsy attempts at air-to-air combat when biplanes barely reached 120 miles per hour, and he'd recognized that as aviation speeds increased, human beings would face a targeting crisis that traditional marksmanship couldn't solve. His paper laid out the mathematics with brutal clarity. Puckle demonstrated that as aircraft speeds increased beyond 150 miles per hour, the deflection angles required would exceed normal human intuitive capability. He calculated that against a target moving at 250 miles per hour at a perpendicular angle, a gunner would need to aim approximately 4 to 5 aircraft lengths ahead of the visible target. His paper included exhaustive tables, charts showing required lead for various combinations of target speed, range, and crossing angle. A 200-yard shot at a 90-degree crossing angle against a 300-mile-per-hour target required 47 feet of lead. Same target at 400 yards required 94 feet. The numbers seemed impossible, and Puckle's conclusion was even more disturbing. Without mechanical assistance, aerial gunners would be effectively useless within a decade. The Army filed his paper, the Navy filed his paper, and everyone forgot about it. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, military aviation advanced rapidly. Speeds increased, altitudes increased, weapon payloads increased, but gunnery training remained rooted in World War I methodology. Instructors taught marksmanship fundamentals: sight picture, trigger control, breath control, as if students were preparing for a rifle competition rather than a three-dimensional chess match at 300 miles per hour where the pieces were trying to kill you. The few voices advocating for advanced deflection training were dismissed as alarmists or overcomplicated theorists. After all, the reasoning went, Americans had always been excellent marksmen. Daniel Boone, Sergeant Alvin York, the frontier tradition of sharpshooting. Surely those skills would translate to aerial combat with proper practice and good American determination. They didn't. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, Marine Corps gunnery training was catastrophically unprepared for the reality of modern air combat in the Pacific. The standard training program lasted 4 weeks. Students fired roughly 1,000 rounds total during their entire qualification course. Most of that ammunition went towards stationary targets and slowly towed sleeves that moved at maybe 150 miles per hour in predictable straight lines. Not a single training scenario replicated the chaos of a Zero diving through a formation at 400 miles per hour while executing a barrel roll and firing 20mm cannon rounds that could cut a man in half. Graduates received their wings. They climbed into Dauntlesses and Avengers. They flew to the South Pacific. They arrived at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, or at airstrips in the Russell Islands, and they discovered their training was worthless the first time a Zero flashed across their gun sight, trailing smoke from its exhaust, there for maybe 2 seconds, close enough to see the pilot's helmet, and then gone before they could even process what lead angle to use. By mid-1943, desperate Marine commanders started digging through old technical libraries and Navy archives, looking for anything that might help. A captain named Robert Williams, assigned to 1st Marine Aircraft Wing Gunnery Analysis Section on Guadalcanal, found Puckle's 1924 paper in a box of documents that had been shipped from the Naval War College. Williams read it in one sitting. Then he immediately drafted a memo to his commanding officer, Colonel Perry Smith, with 3 words underlined twice. He knew everything. Puckle had predicted this exact disaster 18 years before the first Marine SBD ever flew a combat mission over Guadalcanal. His calculations were still accurate, his warnings had been correct, and hundreds of Marine aviators had died because nobody had listened. The question wasn't whether Puckle had been right. The mathematics were indisputable. The question was whether anything could actually be done about it. Training gunners to consciously calculate deflection angles while being shot at seemed impossible. The human brain couldn't process trigonometry at combat speed. But if conscious calculation wouldn't work, maybe something else would. The British had already started finding partial answers, born from the same desperation during the summer of 1940. Royal Air Force Squadron 609, flying Spitfires out of Middle Wallop, faced a gunnery crisis that mirrored what American forces would encounter 2 years later in the Pacific. Their pilots were brave, their aircraft were magnificent, but they were missing German fighters at alarming rates. Flight Lieutenant John Dundas reviewed gun camera footage from July 1940 engagements over the English Channel and discovered his squadron's hit rate against crossing Messerschmitt Bf 109s was hovering around 6%. 6 shots connecting out of every 100 fired. The Spitfire carried enough ammunition for roughly 16 seconds of sustained fire. Pilots were burning through their entire combat load and watching German fighters fly home untouched. Squadron leader Horace Darley, commanding 609 Squadron, made a radical decision. He grounded his entire unit for 3 days in early August 1940, right in the middle of the Battle of Britain, when every fighter was desperately needed in the air. And he conducted live-fire experiments that violated every standard in the RAF training manual. Darley had been a competitive clay pigeon shooter before the war. He understood something about leading moving targets that military theorists had overlooked. The best shotgun shooters didn't calculate lead, they felt it. Their brains processed the target's movement subconsciously. Their hands moved the barrel ahead of the clay disc without conscious mathematical thought. Darley wondered if fighter pilots could learn the same instinctive response. His experiment was brutally simple. He had a Hurricane fighter tow a target, banner across the gunnery range, while his Spitfire pilots made repeated firing passes. But instead of the standard approach, pilots aiming carefully, trying to calculate the precise lead angle, Darley instructed them to do something that sounded insane. Don't aim at all. Instead, watch the target's movement. Let your eyes track its path. Start firing while your aircraft is still turning to follow. Let the deflection happen naturally through the motion of your turn, rather than trying to consciously create it with aiming adjustments. Fire into where your instincts say the target is going, not where your eyes say it currently is. The first attempts were disasters. Pilots missed the banner by 50 feet, their bullets stitching patterns across empty sky, but Darley made them repeat the exercise. Again, 40 passes each over 3 days. No lectures about ballistics, no trigonometry, no tables of deflection angles, just repetition with one simple instruction. Fire while you're still moving, not after you've steadied on target. By the 3rd day, something remarkable happened. The pilots' hit rates began climbing, not dramatically. They went from 6% to maybe 12%. But that doubling meant twice as many bullets hitting German aircraft, which meant twice as many kills, or twice as many damaged enemy fighters returning to base, unable to fly the next mission. Darley documented his results and submitted them to Fighter Command Headquarters on August 18, 1940. His report included a crucial observation that would later prove essential for Marine gunners in the Pacific. The pilots who improved fastest weren't the ones with the best peacetime marksmanship scores. They were the ones who could suppress their instinct to aim carefully, and instead trust their peripheral vision and motion sense. The conscious brain, Darley argued, was too slow for modern air combat. The answer was training the subconscious to handle deflection automatically, the same way a baseball player's brain calculates where a fly ball will land without consciously solving trajectory equations. Fighter Command circulated Darley's findings, but implementation was scattered and inconsistent. Some squadrons adopted the technique enthusiastically, others dismissed it as unscientific nonsense. The RAF's training command was particularly resistant. Their instructors had decades of experience teaching marksmanship fundamentals, and Darley's approach seemed to abandon everything they knew about proper shooting discipline. But combat results didn't lie. Squadrons that embraced motion-based deflection shooting showed measurably better kill ratios through the autumn of 1940. The data was clear enough that by early 1941, the technique was quietly becoming standard practice in the RAF, even if the official training manuals hadn't caught up yet. American military observers in Britain took detailed notes on Darley's methods. Marine Corps. Aviation officers attended RAF briefings and watched training demonstrations. They understood the principle. They saw the results. But the Marine Corps faced a different problem than the RAF. fighter pilots could potentially learn instinctive deflection through repetition. A Spitfire pilot controlled his entire aircraft, using motion and angles to create natural lead, but a Marine gunner in an SBD Dauntless didn't have that luxury. He stood in a fixed position while his pilot flew the mission profile, unable to maneuver independently, unable to use aircraft movement to generate deflection. He had only his hands on the gun, his eyes on the target, and empty sky all around him where he needed to aim. If conscious calculation was too slow and instinctive motion wasn't available, the solution had to be something else entirely, something mechanical, something that could think faster than a human brain while the bullets were already in the air. Enter the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Specifically, a man named Charles Stark Draper, a 40-year-old engineer who'd spent the previous decade developing gyroscopic instruments for aircraft navigation. Draper wasn't working for the military officially when war broke out. He ran what was called the Confidential Instruments Development Laboratory at MIT, a small operation that existed in the grey space between academic research and commercial applications. But Draper understood something fundamental about the deflection problem. He understood that it wasn't really about shooting, it was about prediction. A gun sight needed to show the gunner not where the target currently was, but where the target would be when the bullets arrived. The human brain couldn't do that calculation consciously at combat speed, but a machine could. The Mark 14 computing gun sight emerged from Draper's laboratory in prototype form by May 1941, months before the United States even entered the war. It looked like something from science fiction. A reflector sight connected to a gyroscope system that weighed 28 pounds and required electrical power from the aircraft or ship's generator system. The gunner operated it through a mechanical ranging control. He turned a dial to match a set of reference marks to the target's wingspan, which gave the sight the range information it needed. Then he tracked the target for approximately 2 seconds while keeping it centered in a small tracking circle. During those 2 seconds, the gyroscope measured the target's angular velocity, how fast it was moving across the gunner's field of view. Here's where the system became remarkable. The Mark 14's internal mechanism used a series of cams and gears, analog computers built from machined metal, to solve the deflection equation in real time. It took the range input from the gunner, the angular velocity from the gyroscope, and the known ballistic properties of the ammunition, then calculated exactly how far ahead of the target the guns needed to point. It displayed the result as a lighted reticle that appeared to float in space ahead of the target. The gunner didn't aim at the aircraft anymore. He aimed at the glowing dot. And if he'd ranged correctly and tracked smoothly, the dot showed him exactly where to shoot. The Mark 14 solved mathematics that would take a human brain several minutes using pencil and paper, and it solved those equations 30 times per second, continuously updating as the target's angle and range changed. The Navy was skeptical at first. The device seemed too complicated, too delicate, too prone to breaking under combat conditions. But Draper convinced them to conduct tests. Naval Air Station Norfolk, Virginia, during August 1941, produced results that seemed almost impossible. Gunners who'd never achieved better than 5% hit rates against crossing targets immediately jumped to 18% with the Mark 14. And that was on their first day using the system. After a week of practice, rates climbed above 25%. That was a 5-fold improvement over manual aiming, which translated directly into 5 times more enemy aircraft damaged or destroyed per engagement. The Navy ordered 12 experimental units in August 1941. By the time Pearl Harbor was attacked in December, production contracts had been signed with the Sperry Gyroscope Company for full-scale manufacturing. But there was a problem. Manufacturing tens of thousands of complex gyroscopic sights would take time. The sights required precision machining, calibration, testing. Installation aboard ships and aircraft required electrical modifications that couldn't be done quickly. Production didn't begin in meaningful numbers until mid-1942. Installation priority went to capital ships first, battleships and cruisers with their heavy anti-aircraft batteries, then carriers, then destroyers, aircraft. Installation came later still, and even then, not every aircraft could accommodate the Mark 14's weight and power requirements. The SBD Dauntless, the Marine Corps primary dive bomber through most of the war, never received the Mark 14 in significant numbers. The aircraft's electrical system couldn't support it reliably. The weight and balance issues were problematic. Most critically, by the time sufficient Mark 14 sites became available for widespread aircraft installation, production priorities had shifted to newer aircraft types. That meant the majority of Marine gunners flying missions through 1943 and into early 1944 were still using basic iron sights or crude reflector sights with no computing ability whatsoever. They needed something they could implement immediately, without waiting for new technology, without requiring electrical modifications to their aircraft, without depending on supply chains that might take months or years to reach forward bases in the Pacific. They needed a technique that worked with the equipment they already had, and remarkably, that technique came not from engineers or scientists or military theorists, but from combat gunners themselves, from men who'd been shooting at Japanese fighters long enough to develop their own solutions born from desperation and survival. Staff Sergeant William Bill Fleming wasn't famous, wasn't an officer, didn't have a college education, couldn't explain gyroscopic precession if his life depended on it. But by March 1944, Fleming had flown 31 combat missions as a gunner aboard SBD Dauntlesses, operating from various bases in the Russell Islands and the Solomons. He'd survived 4 aircraft losses, he'd fired approximately 40,000 rounds in combat, and he'd personally witnessed hits on 7 enemy aircraft. He'd also kept a notebook. Fleming's notebook contained something unusual: sketches of enemy aircraft with hand-drawn lines extending forward from their noses, showing where he'd actually aimed during successful engagements. He'd measured these lead distances by comparing them to the target aircraft's length, 2 plane lengths ahead, 3 plane lengths ahead, sometimes more for steep crossing angles or high-speed passes. On March 14, 1944, Fleming presented his notebook to Lieutenant Commander Edward Butch O'Hare during a routine debriefing session at Marine Corps Air Station Turtle Bay in the Russell Islands. O'Hare, already a Medal of Honor recipient and one of the Navy's top fighter tacticians, immediately recognized what he was seeing. Empirical deflection data gathered under actual combat conditions. O'Hare ordered Fleming to conduct training sessions with every gunner in Marine Scout Bombing Squadron, 243 and 244, the units currently operating from Turtle Bay. Not classroom lectures, not diagrams and mathematics, practical exercises using a simple technique that would later become known as the spot shooting method. Fleming would have gunners stand at their positions while another Marine walked along the airstrip holding a model aircraft on a pole. As the model flew past at various angles, Fleming coached gunners to extend their aim forward by specific increments. 1 aircraft length for slight crossing angles, 2 lengths for moderate angles, 3 or more for steep crossing shots. The key was giving gunners a visual reference they could remember and apply instantly without conscious calculation. Count plane lengths forward from the nose, then fire. No trigonometry, no tables, no complex mathematics, just a simple measuring system that used the target itself as the measuring stick. The Marine Corps gunnery officer at Turtle Bay, Captain James Morrison, was skeptical but desperate for anything that might work. He authorized controlled testing during squadron operations over Rabaul and Cavien through late March, early April 1944. He pulled ammunition expenditure records and combat action reports for the previous 8 weeks, establishing baseline hit rates. Then he tracked the same metrics after Fleming's training program rolled out across both squadrons. The results were undeniable. Prior to the training, Marine gunners in VMSB 243 and 244 averaged 4.3 hits per 100 rounds fired against crossing targets. By the end of April, just 6 weeks after implementing spot shooting, that rate had climbed to 9.4 hits per 100 rounds. The technique had more than doubled their effectiveness. Word spread through Marine aviation units in the Pacific with remarkable speed. By May 1944, Variations of Fleming's spot shooting method were being taught at forward bases throughout the Solomon Islands, New Georgia, and the Russell Islands. Each unit's gunnery officers added their own refinements, but the core principle remained. Give gunners a simple visual measurement system tied directly to the target's apparent size, eliminating the need for conscious calculation. A gunner didn't need to know he was compensating for 0.3 seconds of bullet flight time. He didn't need to understand angular velocity or ballistic coefficients. He just needed to remember 3 plane lengths forward for a crossing shot at medium range, 2 lengths for closer engagements, 4 or more for extreme deflection angles. The technique worked because it matched how human visual processing actually functions. Our brains are exceptional at relative size comparison, but terrible at absolute distance estimation. Asking a gunner to lead by 50 feet meant nothing when he had no reference for what 50 feet looked like at 300 yards through the chaos of combat. But lead by 2 plane lengths gave him an immediate visual standard he could apply without conscious thought. The zero he was tracking provided its own measuring stick. He just had to extend that measurement forward into empty space. The enemy aircraft became both the target and the ruler. It was elegant in its simplicity, and it saved lives. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The Marine Corps formally incorporated spot shooting principles into training doctrine during summer 1944. Technical manuals started including illustrations showing proper lead distances expressed in multiples of target wingspan or fuselage length. The Aerial Gunnery School at Marine Corps Air Station El Centro in California rebuilt their entire training program around the technique during June and July. But knowing the technique and executing it under combat conditions remained 2 entirely different challenges. The human brain, even armed with the spot shooting method, still fought against itself when the shooting started. Marine psychologists embedded with aviation units documented this phenomenon extensively during 1944 interviews with returning gunners. The issue wasn't knowledge. Gunners could recite proper lead distances perfectly during debriefings. The issue was that conscious knowledge evaporated under stress, replaced by primal instinct that screamed aim at the threat. Captain Harold Klein, a Navy psychologist temporarily assigned to Marine Air Group 22 at Emerau Island, studied this response through analysis of gun camera footage paired with post-mission interviews. He identified a pattern he termed threat fixation collapse. Gunners would start an engagement using proper deflection, but as the enemy fighter closed and the perceived danger intensified, their aim point would progressively drift backward until they were shooting directly at, or even behind, the target. Klein's data showed this collapse happened fastest during head-on attacks, where the closing speed between bomber and fighter exceeded 500 miles per hour, and the gunner had perhaps 2 seconds before the enemy opened fire. Under that extreme stress, rational technique dissolved into pure reaction. Point at the scary thing, pull trigger. The only solution was repetition so extensive that deflection shooting bypassed conscious thought entirely, embedding itself at the same neurological level as walking or catching a thrown ball. This required training time the military simply couldn't afford in 1942 and 1943, when every able-bodied Marine was needed in combat immediately. But by late 1944, with Allied control of the air improving across the Pacific and training pipelines more established, Marine gunnery schools extended their programs significantly. The standard course that had been 4 weeks in 1942 expanded to 8 weeks by mid-1944, then 10 weeks by early 1945. Students now fired 5,000 rounds during training instead of 1,000, and significantly, over half of those rounds went toward moving targets at realistic combat speeds. The Aerial Gunnery School at Marine Corps Air Station Cherry Point in North Carolina pioneered a particularly effective drill starting in September 1944. They mounted 50 caliber guns on motorized turrets that could spin and elevate rapidly, then had high-speed boats tow targets across the water at speeds up to 60 miles per hour while varying their distance and crossing angles randomly. Gunner trainees engaged these targets repeatedly, 50 to 70 passes per day, until the act of leading became automatic. Instructors didn't correct students verbally during the drills. They simply had them shoot, check their hit pattern, adjust, and shoot again. The subconscious learned through feedback loops faster than the conscious mind learned through instruction. The body learned what the brain couldn't process consciously. Elite gunners who survived 30 or more missions demonstrated something remarkable in combat footage analysis conducted by Marine Aviation Intelligence officers during 1945. Their deflection aim points remained stable even under intense stress. When a Zero came screaming through the formation with cannon fire flashing from its wings, these experienced gunners maintained their lead automatically. Their conscious minds could be terrified. Many admitted in debriefings to being absolutely convinced they were about to die during certain engagements. But their hands kept the proper sight picture anyway. They'd achieved what martial artists call mushin, or no mind, the state where technique happens without conscious direction. But that level of proficiency took time and ammunition most gunners never received. The mathematics of wartime training were brutal. If creating an expert deflection shooter required 5,000 practice rounds and 10 weeks of intensive training, but the Pacific Offensive needed 50,000 new gunners in 6 months, compromises were inevitable. The majority of Marine gunners flying combat missions through 1944 never achieved true unconscious competence. They remained perpetually in the conscious competent stage, capable of proper deflection shooting when conditions allowed them time to think, but vulnerable to collapse under extreme stress or when facing unexpected tactical situations. This created a strange stratification in combat effectiveness. A bomber formation's defensive firepower wasn't uniform across all aircraft. It depended heavily on which specific gunners were in which specific positions on which specific aircraft. A formation that happened to include several veterans with deep training could fight off attacks that would devastate a formation of newer crews. Japanese fighter pilots learned to identify and exploit this vulnerability. Veteran Japanese aviators, those who survived into 1944 and 1945, would make initial probing passes against bomber formations, observing which aircraft showed hesitant or inaccurate fire. They'd then focus subsequent attacks on those bombers, avoiding formations where the defensive fire was immediate, heavy, and precisely placed. The deflection shooting revolution that began with Puckle's ignored warnings in 1924, accelerated through British experiments in 1940, and matured through American desperation and innovation through 1943 and 1944, didn't end when World War II concluded in 1945. The core principle that you must aim where the target will be, not where it is, became foundational to every weapon system developed afterward. The Mark 14 computing gun sight evolved into the Mark 18, which served through the Korean War and into the early Vietnam conflict. Then it evolved into digital fire control computers that could process dozens of variables simultaneously. By the Vietnam War, fighter aircraft carried radar-assisted gun systems that calculated deflection automatically, requiring pilots only to keep targets within acquisition parameters. The F-4 Phantom's lead computing optical sight system did in microseconds what had taken Draper's mechanical gyroscope significant fractions of a second to accomplish. Modern air-to-air combat has largely moved beyond guns entirely. Missiles handle interception at ranges where deflection would require leading by miles rather than feet. But the underlying physics hasn't changed, just the implementation. An AIM-120 AMRAAM missile uses inertial guidance and active radar to continuously update its trajectory toward where its target will be, executing deflection calculations thousands of times per second. The F-22 Raptor's AN/APG-77 radar doesn't just track targets. It predicts their future positions based on current velocity and acceleration, then positions the aircraft and selects weapons accordingly. It's the same problem William Fleming solved with hand-drawn sketches in his notebook in 1944, now handled by computers processing teraflops instead of gunners counting plane lengths. Interestingly, deflection shooting fundamentals remain part of modern fighter pilot training. Despite guns being tertiary weapons in contemporary air combat, the Navy Fighter Weapons School, Top Gun, still teaches basic fighter maneuvers that include guns-only engagements, not because pilots expect to dogfight with cannons, but because learning to visually predict where a maneuvering target will be develops spatial awareness that applies to every aspect of air combat. A pilot who's mastered deflection shooting intuitively understands closure rates, angle off, and lead pursuit curves, concepts that matter whether you're firing a cannon or positioning for a missile shot. The cognitive skills transfer seamlessly. The lessons extend beyond aviation into any domain, involving fast-moving targets. Modern anti-aircraft systems, from the Phalanx CIWS defending naval vessels to the CRAM protecting ground bases, are essentially sophisticated implementations of what those 1943 Marine gunners struggled to do manually. The Phalanx fires 4,500 rounds per minute, 75 rounds per second, at incoming missiles and aircraft. Its radar continuously calculates deflection and updates aim point. It makes the same corrections Tommy Chen needed over Guadalcanal in February 1943, just faster and without the human hesitation that cost so many lives. Even video games that simulate combat incorporate deflection mechanics, teaching players the same counterintuitive principle. Aim where the target is going. Games like War Thunder and Digital Combat Simulator require players to lead moving targets manually, and new players experience the exact same frustration 1942 Marine gunners felt, watching their tracers pass harmlessly behind enemy aircraft until they internalize that leading is necessary. The most skilled players develop the same unconscious competence that combat veterans achieved. Their hands adjust aim without conscious thought, responding to target motion automatically. The neural pathways are identical, whether formed in combat over the Pacific or in a simulator 70 years later. The transformation from 5% hit rates in early 1943 to 25% by late 1944 represents one of the most dramatic tactical improvements achieved by any military force during World War II. And it was accomplished not through superior equipment alone, not through overwhelming numbers, but through understanding and working with human cognition rather than against it. Thousands of Marine aviators who would have died continued flying missions. Enemy fighters that would have escaped went down in flames. Bombing campaigns that might have failed reached their targets. All because someone finally acknowledged that human instinct, however strong, could be wrong, and that survival meant training people to ignore what felt natural and trust what physics demanded. The Marine gunners who learned to aim at empty sky, who forced themselves to fire at nothing visible and trust their bullets would meet metal, proved something essential about human adaptability under pressure. We're not prisoners of our instincts. With proper understanding, sufficient training, and enough desperation, we can rewire our responses to match reality, rather than demanding reality match our intuitions. That lesson, born in blood over Guadalcanal and Rabaul, the Russell Islands, and the Philippines, remains relevant anywhere humans confront situations where instinct and solution point in opposite directions. The Marine Corps itself learned this lesson so thoroughly that it became encoded in institutional memory. By 1945, as operations shifted to Okinawa and preparations began for the planned invasion of Japan itself, Marine aerial gunnery had transformed from a catastrophic liability into a genuine tactical advantage. Combat action reports from Marine aviation units operating during the Okinawa campaign from April through June 1945 show average hit rates against conventional Japanese aircraft exceeding 30%. 30%. That was 6 times better than the 5% recorded in early 1943. 6 times more bullets finding their targets. 6 times more enemy aircraft damaged or destroyed. 6 times more Marines coming home alive. The introduction of kamikaze tactics created new challenges that deflection shooting addressed differently. A kamikaze pilot committed to a suicide dive didn't maneuver to evade fire. He flew a direct intercept course toward his target ship or formation. This actually simplified the deflection problem for Marine gunners defending against kamikazes. Against a target flying straight toward you or on a predictable intercept course, deflection requirements decreased dramatically. The Zero diving at your formation from 12,000 feet wasn't trying to survive. He was trying to hit. That meant his flight path became more predictable, which meant gunners could concentrate fire more effectively. Navy records from the Okinawa campaign show that anti-aircraft gunners, both shipboard and aircraft-based, achieved significantly higher hit rates against kamikazes than they had against conventional fighter attacks earlier in the war. Part of this improvement came from the introduction of proximity-fused ammunition for larger caliber weapons, but a significant portion came from improved deflection, shooting techniques applied against targets that flew predictable paths. Marine fighter squadrons operating from captured airfields on Okinawa during May and June 1945 claimed over 200 Japanese aircraft destroyed, with many of those kills attributed to bomber gunners defending their formations. The Marines had travelled a long road from those desperate days over Guadalcanal, but the cost had been immense. The lesson had been paid for in blood. In the wreckage of aircraft that went down over the Pacific because their gunners couldn't connect with fast-moving targets. In the bodies of young men who died because their training had been insufficient and their instincts had been wrong. The Marine Corps documented these losses meticulously, not to assign blame, but to learn, to ensure that the mistakes of 1942 and early 1943 would never be repeated, that future generations of Marine aviators would have the training and the techniques necessary to survive aerial combat. Staff Sergeant William Fleming, the gunner whose notebook had sparked the spot shooting revolution, survived the war. He flew 47 combat missions total, witnessed hits on 11 enemy aircraft, and trained over 300 gunners in deflection shooting techniques before the war ended. He received a Bronze Star for his contributions to marine aviation tactics. Fleming returned to civilian life in 1946, worked as a machinist in San Diego, and rarely spoke about his wartime experiences. He died in 1992 at the age of 70. His notebook, with its hand-drawn sketches showing proper lead distances, ended up in the Marine Corps archives at Quantico, Virginia, where it remains today as a testament to the ingenuity and adaptability of combat veterans. Tommy Chen, the young Marine gunner from the opening of this story, also survived the war. He flew 32 combat missions, claimed 3 confirmed hits on enemy aircraft, and returned home to San Francisco in 1945. He later told interviewers that the single most important thing he learned during the war was to trust the training even when his instincts screamed otherwise. The skies over the Pacific in 1945 looked very different than they had in 1942. American aircraft dominated. Japanese aviation had been decimated by losses in pilots, aircraft, and fuel. The training pipeline that had produced skilled Japanese aviators early in the war had collapsed under the weight of attrition, but the lessons learned in deflection shooting remained relevant because they spoke to fundamental truths about human perception and physics. Those truths don't change regardless of who's doing the shooting or what they're shooting at. The bullet still takes time to travel. The target still moves during that time. The gunner still has to aim at empty space and trust. The Marine Corps institutionalized these lessons in post-war training doctrine. The techniques developed through desperate innovation during combat became standardized curriculum taught to every aerial gunner. The spot shooting method, the emphasis on unconscious competence through repetition, the understanding of threat fixation, collapse, and how to counteract it, all of these insights became foundational to marine aviation training. And when new challenges emerged, new technologies, new enemies, new tactical situations, the underlying principle remained constant. Aim where the target will be, not where it is. Trust the physics. Ignore the instinct. The legacy of those early deflection shooting pioneers, from Puckle's theoretical papers to Darley's practical experiments to Fleming's combat-tested techniques, extends forward through every subsequent generation of military aviation. The specifics change, technology evolves, but the core challenge remains identical. How do you hit something that's moving faster than your conscious mind can process? The answer, learned at such terrible cost over the Pacific, is that you don't try to process it consciously. You train until the processing happens automatically. You practice until instinct aligns with reality. You shoot until your hands know what your brain can't calculate. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.